I'm Stephen Price.
Hello, I'm Cara Githens.
This is The Innkeepers, a podcast by Sanctuary Inn. At Sanctuary Inn, we believe we are called to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers.
On this podcast, we will be interviewing guests who have much to teach us about the many facets of missionary care. Let's learn together and be encouraged to press on in the work God has given each one of us to do.
Hi, this is Steve.
Hello, this is Cara.
And we'd like to welcome you to another episode of the Innkeepers podcast.
Yes, we are interviewing Tammy Sharp today. Steve, how about you tell us about her?
Yeah, so Tammy was born and raised in Brazil, where her parents served as teachers and administrators at Amazon Valley Academy. Later, she attended Wheaton College because she decided she wanted to be a teacher so she could return to teach at a Missionary Kids school somewhere in the world. She actually, after some time in Alaska, ended up back in Brazil teaching at Amazon Valley Academy. And then she went on to do her master's in education. And instead of going back overseas, which she thought she was going to do, she ended up working for her missions agency for 17 years as the MK, or Missionary Kid Coordinator, serving the kids in that organization. In January 2018, Tammy joined Barnabas International as a consultant for their Third Culture Kid program and director of Mukapa, which you'll hear more about in this broadcast here. So Tammy also recently has agreed to serve on the board of Sanctuary Inn, and so we're excited to have her on the board and helping us care for God's global workers.
Well, let's get started. Hello, Tammy. I'm so glad you're here with us today. So as we start out today, it would be great if you could share with us a little bit of your story and how you became passionate about missionary kid care.
Yeah, sure. Love to share. The first thing is I grew up at a missionary kids school, actually in Brazil, at the mouth of the Amazon. And my parents had gone there to teach and to work at this school, Amazon Valley Academy. So I was born there in Brazil and lived on that school property, 0 to 18.
Wow.
Except for our home ministry years.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I got very interested in MK or missionary kid care from my parents, because both of my parents really loved missionary kids. Teaching at the school, my dad became the principal. They were very involved. And even after they left the school to work in our mission home office, they continued to hold up the flag of MK care and the need for that. And so I just saw that my whole life from my parents. So I was interested in going back to teach overseas in another school somewhere to teach missionary kids. So that's what I went to college to do, to become a teacher. And I ended up teaching in America first, but I did go back to Brazil to teach at the same school I grew up at. But kind of funny story about that, I was trying to go teach in Asia or somewhere else in the world because I had been there, done that in Brazil.
Uh-huh.
And so when I was calling different places trying to find a teaching job, there was one that they needed a history teacher at Amazon Valley Academy. So I ended up there. So that was one thing that the Lord used in my life, was my past experience as a missionary kid and my parents who loved missionary kids, but also I just felt the Lord calling me to that later. After teaching in the US and teaching back in Brazil, I was finishing graduate school and just wondering what was next after that. And I just really felt the Lord calling me to work with missionary kids. And so I ended up joining my mission agency to be the MK coordinator there.
Great. Thanks.
So I did that for a while. Now I work at Barnabas International.
Yeah.
Well, I know in the world of missionary kids and missions in general, missionary kids and so on, there's a lot of letters, MKs and TCKs and adult TCKs and so on. So maybe if you could just take a minute and run through the little alphabet for us and define each of those, so that when we're talking today, we don't want to get tangled up in any of this conversation. So take a minute and do some of those definitions for us.
Yeah, for sure. I'd already used that one. MK, which is missionary kid, which I am a MK. So MK is a child of a missionary. Some people like to use the word, use missionary's kid, a kid belonging to a missionary, because sometimes saying missionary kid, that means the kid is not the missionary themselves. It's like, kid growing up in a missionary home. And then missionary kid is a subset of a broader category called TCK, third culture kid. And the third culture kid is this developmental ages of 0 to 18 of kids that are growing up, and a significant part of that developmental age in a country or culture that's different than one of their parents' passport cultures or passports homes, because of the parents' work. So a third culture kid could include diplomats, military, business kids, missionary kids. And then an ATCK is an adult third culture kid. So an adult, we usually say ATCK instead of AMK. So it just means an adult who as a kid grew up overseas or grew up in a cross-cultural setting. And now there's a new category, or another category called CCK, which is cross-cultural kid. And that's the biggest kind of overarching category that third culture kid and MK can fit underneath. But the cross-cultural kid is this developmental ages of kids that have meaningful interaction with different cultures as they're growing up. And so this could be biracial families or kids of adopted different nationalities, or a Mexican family that immigrated to California, but the kids are crossing cultures every day, or there's some kind of moving piece. So there's CCK, TCK, and MK. So cross-cultural kid, third culture kid, missionary kid. And then the A that goes in front of that is an adult who was as a kid, grew up. Yeah.
Okay.
That's very
sorry. That's a lot.
No, I know, but I think those categories help.
Yeah, it's important to have those definitions.
So what do you think mission teams and local churches need to understand about these different groups and these kids growing up among world, as some would say?
Yeah, one of the when I was thinking about working with third culture kids and missionary kids, I came across an article that Dave Pollock wrote, and he co-authored a book called Third Culture Kids with Ruth Van Rieken. But this article, he was talking about the three reasons why we should care about missionary kids and third culture kids. And one was that they exist, that he had the 3 Ps. One was the presence of them, is that as churches, as agencies, and just in general in the world, we know that a lot of the world does not know the gospel, and that there's a need for sending people and people going out, whether it's in business or believers being part of the world. So there's a presence of third culture kids and a need for missionary kids in the world. And so as a responsibility to love and care for other people, one of the commandments is that the presence of them, that we should, care for other people and third culture kids, missionary kids. And another reason for local churches and organizations is just the parents. So the second P is parents. Is like, how do we come alongside parents and encourage them as they're raising their kids in these awesome places or difficult places? How do we come alongside parents? And the third P that Dave Pollock mentioned was potential. As third culture kids are growing up and have these different skill sets and language skill sets, the potential that they have to change the world. to be global citizens, to advance the Lord's work and what he's doing around the world. So that was just a good framework for me when I was thinking about it. It's just that the presence of TCKs, the parents, how do we come alongside parents, and then the potential that TCKs have to impact the world.
I know in my own life, I've met some adult TCKs, and for the longest time, I didn't even know. They didn't let on. There wasn't anything that I would know. But then all of a sudden, someone busts out in another language that they're fluent in. I'm like, wait a minute, how did that happen? Or I know a young man who grew up in India, and he has some musical ability that is cultural to India, that is some of the best in the world. He's an amazing, he's taken on some local talent there, and it's like, wow. So as we talk about that, let's talk a little bit about some of the benefits of growing up in a culture outside your home culture. What are some of the benefits kids reap from that?
Yeah, well, you mentioned one of them, the language skills of being able to communicate in another language, having some kind of linguistic skills. I wish I had learned Portuguese a little bit better. I can get around in Brazil if I need to, but yeah, just like you mentioned, that guy that knew about the Indian music, but just this expanded worldview of seeing the world more than just yourself and your neighborhood or your city.
Yeah.
And so there's kind of this expanded worldview. I think a lot of MKs have a real sense of empathy. It's a positive thing of really feeling for other people that are going through struggles or hard times. Also, just cross-cultural skills of being able to enter into new cultures and new situations, being very observant and seeing what's around you. And one of my favorites, because I just used this positive thing recently, is having friends all over. So I just was on a 3-week road trip, and I only stayed in a hotel once. And the main reason for the hotel was that I was sick. But yeah, being able to travel for 3 weeks and stay with people I know, whether they're coworkers or friends. I flew into Charlotte, North Carolina, and stayed with a girl. We're 6 days apart. I've known her since I was 0, basically. Yeah, that I've known her my whole life. We grew up together, and she lives in Charlotte. And so just, being able to stay with her and other friends along the way and people all over that, so.
Yeah, I love that one too. I often talk about, we should go on a trip. Oh, and we can stay here, and I know someone here, and I know we can stay here. Like I can travel the world and stay everywhere without a hotel.
Yeah, my Japanese friends picked me up in Tokyo and took me around for a couple of days, put me up a hotel, just went to England, went to Scotland, who knows? People all over, so that's super fun.
Well, I think one of the things you mentioned, though, is just the whole idea of the empathy and how I think people, young people that have grown up outside of their home culture can more easily come alongside someone that's really struggling with something, or a greater identification with someone. Especially, you can imagine yourself in a new situation where you don't know the language and you don't know how to shop and don't know how to get around. And I think more easily they can step in and be a friend to someone like that. And they probably, I'm guessing this is true. I don't know, have a statistic, but I'm thinking on a university campus, missionary kids are probably going to gravitate to the international students and probably create those friendships with international students at the, in a way that maybe the other students wouldn't do that. So.
Yeah, for sure, seeing that.
Yes. And we've lived that. I've lived that.
Yeah. And when I was living in Kansas City, I worked with international students there. I was assigned girls from like Togo and Benin, and I've never lived in West Africa, but just helping them adjust to living in Kansas City and thinking through I moved from Brazil to college, and that was a big transition for me. So
we understand transitions.
We do.
So what do you think are some of the struggles and the drawbacks that a TCK, especially in those young adult years when they're transitioning to college, perhaps, what are some of the struggles?
I think several came to mind, but one of them is this identity kind of formation of who am I? Just kind of who am I and where I belong. So this identity and belonging are ones that come up in college and even into young adults. Also, this idea of, because of so many transitions and moving that are part of the TCK experience, there can be unresolved grief. And not having processed that, and that can often come up later in the young adulthood years. One of the things I personally have struggled with, and this is true of some, is confused loyalties.
Yeah.
Just recently, I was digging out my 3 passports because my office at work was asking for my passport. And so I just sent them my US passport and a copy of it. And they're like, yeah, what about your other 2? Yeah. So, where do we belong? Do we, these TCKs that are have grown up in Ukraine and Russia, and, and there's this war right now. It's, what does that look like for them, and how are they processing that, where they're from and where they belong and how they fit in the world. Other ones are like being rootless and restless sometimes.
Yeah.
After college, I lived in Alaska for 5 years, and I'm like, whoa, 5 years, I got to go somewhere else, and
Yes, I definitely have felt that itch too. Like, okay, I've been here for this long, and I start thinking about what next. And I think we get used to constantly moving. And so
yeah,
I think moving is the normal.
Yeah. The place I live right now, my brother said, to make it this a financial good option for me, he said, I need to live here 17 years. And
Wow.
He said, Tammy, can you live somewhere for 17 years? So I said, yeah, no. But,
yeah.
So we'll see.
It'll work out. Yeah. I think it's probably important for people to understand that sometimes families don't have a lot of say when they move or where they move for a lot of different reasons. And you were talking about the unresolved grief, and it's not always the time to say goodbye and say your goodbyes or leave well from the countries. Do you want to just talk about that a little bit, about people that have had to leave more suddenly?
Yeah, for sure. Any transition is hard, but when it's expected, these expected transitions of like, I'm going to graduate from high school, I'm going to graduate from college, or it's furlough time, it gives a little bit of time to hopefully build a raft, which is a tool that's used in transition. But with COVID and crisis now in the world, it's a lot of TCKs have had to evacuate or to leave suddenly, or in other countries there's been earthquakes or different things. That is a harder transition because it doesn't provide the kids an opportunity to leave well. And it's when you don't leave well, it's hard to enter well into the next place that you live.
Yeah.
And so there's some things that you can do to kind of go back and think about or like process, but the unresolved grief can build up if those things aren't kind of thought through. And so we're seeing a lot more of that now in the world because of different crises that have happened that were unexpected.
Okay. So in the whole area of transition, let's talk a little bit about a young person who's 18 or 19 and they've made a choice. They're going to come back to their parents' home culture to go to college, whether that's the States or Canada or another country. What kinds of things do they encounter that maybe we say or do things that kind of maybe aren't helpful, but what kinds of things do they encounter that a lot of us might not even be aware of?
I think the first thing is that a lot of people feel that they're coming back home, where the home is a interesting word. I saw one of those memes, like for a TCK, where's home? And it's like all over the place. And so a lot of times churches or family is like, aren't you glad to be home? But it's not home. It's not where they were growing up. And the question of where are you from is a really difficult question to ask or to answer. And so I often will say, when I talk to TCKs, I say, where did you grow up?
Mhm.
because that's a little bit easier question to ask than where are you from.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things I think that's challenging. I think another thing that can be challenging on the transition is this idea of being a hidden immigrant.
Right.
And so oftentimes, like, an immigrant oftentimes looks different than the culture around them, but a third culture kid going back to the parents' home country or back for college is looking like the culture around them.
Right.
And so this expectation that they should know everything or know how to get around, or how to do things that the culture already understands and knows. And so I think back to your story about the person that didn't know that they were a third culture kid.
Right.
So oftentimes people don't want to say that because they don't want to be different than everybody around them, and they want to try and fit in. But then it's hard when you don't know what to do or how to act or how to. I remember standing in a grocery store, and when I came back to Canada first and then the US, but right next to the person in front of me. And I didn't realize, how much personal space Americans need around them. Growing up in a Latin culture is like, there's no personal space. And, it just took me a while to I needed to observe the culture around me, but they were like, why is this white person standing right next to me in my line, and just, not thinking about that. And so those are just a couple of things, that are really hard, that makes it harder for the third culture kids coming back to the parents' culture.
I think they can look and feel very uncomfortable, and people around them are like, why, what's going on? Why don't you know? And it's probably the question, why don't you know this?
Mhm.
Because they didn't grow up. They didn't grow up in the school system. They didn't grow up with the public transportation. They did, in where they're moving back to, and so on. And so it's all those mysteries. They have to solve all those mysteries, and hopefully there's someone that can help them walk through those situations.
Yeah, sometimes it's easier being a foreigner in another culture because people don't expect you to know everything or act in the right way necessarily. So you can get away with some mistakes as a foreigner.
Yeah. I remember a family friend when I came back at 18 from Brazil. She's like, you are as American as apple pie, but you really aren't. Like this dissonance that she saw in me, that I look like I'm American, I speak perfect English, but she knew that I had experienced a completely different life that she couldn't even comprehend. So I think that was actually helpful to me to have someone who was a supporter of our family. She at least acknowledged that, I looked like I should fit in. I didn't. And I think that dissonance is really hard for a lot of TCKs. That feeling of I should, but I can't. And this feeling of, hey, if I took you to where I grew up, you would stick out. So let's, giving that flip side is that we were competent somewhere. We're just not competent here.
Yeah. That feeling of competence or lack of competence in a new place is really a tough feeling to deal with, because you knew your way around somewhere else and you knew you could easily function. And now you're in quote unquote your home culture, which isn't. But anyway, you're still trying to figure it out. So when a young person comes and they're maybe like in Cara's situation, she, I think she had people that did step in and help her. But how do young people make the transition well? Are there things, if they're near their home church, what can their home church do to help them, or family, friends? How do they step in and help?
Yeah, I think actually Cara said one of the things that I was going to mention is just acknowledging that that are different or could be different or grew up in a different culture. So I think that can be helpful. One of the things I think a lot about is relationship. So I've had churches say to me, I want to help a TCK in college. Can you just assign me one? Well, most of us don't want to necessarily connect with strangers, like it's helpful if you get to know them. And so for churches that have families that they've sent out, and to have people in that church to know the family, maybe to have visited them, to connect with them, to invite the family, to invite the TCK to their home, to get to know them in a personal, relational way, I think is super helpful. One of the things that my parents did really well, they did, and I thought about like my transition to college. It was my parents actually that took ownership of helping me, and they did 3 things that were super helpful. One is that they understood what a TCK was. And granted, they worked at a Missionary Kids school in Brazil, but they had read stuff that Dave Pollock was writing back in those days, and they understood that I was struggling because I was a third culture kid, and gave me the grace and the space for that. And another thing they did was my prayer. So praying for TCKs, my parents actually my mom set up a prayer team for me when I was going into college. And this is back in the day before email. So it was really, I had to write these little notes, but I sent it to one person who photocopied it and sent it out to the prayer team of ways to pray for me, connect with me. Yeah, they understood the TCK, they said the prayer partners. Yeah, so I just looking back, appreciated that. For churches, well, for my extended family who I didn't know because I didn't grow up with them, I had an aunt and uncle that made a home away from home for me. And so my parents, that was the third thing. They made sure I knew where to go for vacation, not vacation, but like
holidays.
Holidays and summers. So an aunt and uncle, and they said, this is, if you need a place to go, this aunt and uncle, I lived with them for 3 summers in college.
Yeah.
Anyway, that aunt and uncle always said, you have a home here, you can come to here, and always had a room for me. And so that was really comforting to me to know that I had somewhere to go when my parents went back to Brazil.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I forgot my parents did do is they actually took time to teach me to drive, set up my bank account, did all these skill sets that really helped in that transition. So sometimes families can't do that, but like churches and extended family, there's this skill set. Most American kids have a job or have some kind of work experience in this teen years. A lot of third culture kids do not have that and are coming in at 18, do not have work experience. So hiring one, or helping with driving, or simple things that most American kids have going into college, I think is super helpful in some of the practical things.
Yeah. Well, can we just take a second and talk about Mukapa for a second? And
sure.
Talk about your work with Mukapa and how it connects with Missionary Kids on college campuses?
Yeah, Mukapa is Greek letters for M and K. So for a Missionary Kid. So it started as like a campus club for Missionary Kids on a college campus. It started back in the 1980s at Taylor. And so the Taylor students, Taylor's in Indiana, they wanted to, how do we help students transition into college? So this Mukapa was set up then, and it spread to other college campuses. And it's a ministry under Barnabas International. So I'm the director of Mukapa, and there's probably about 20 chapters around the country, and we're trying to expand and grow it more. But it's students who are doing that peer transition support to help the students transition in and out of college. To come alongside of them and answering questions, helping them adjust to culture, helping them find churches, that practical support. And then there's a faculty sponsor that's on campus that can also help. So some of the schools have good connections with local churches that can help and support them, encourage them. So it's just been really neat to see students themselves taking ownership for how to help other TCKs on their campus. So I just was on a trip visiting a couple of campuses, and it was really cool to see the students, loving others well.
I personally benefited from Mukapa when I was at Biola in my college years, and what I loved was the retreats at the Mukapa retreats that Biola had were some of the highlights of my years. That spending a whole weekend just with other MKs when I felt like a fish out of water everywhere else, and then those retreats just was a place where I was known, and it was huge for me.
I was just at Messiah this last month in Pennsylvania, and I asked them what is their favorite event that they do during the year, and they mentioned retreats as well. But yeah, that feeling where you can be yourself, you don't have to explain your eccentric stuff to other people. You don't have to try to fit in. You can just be with other people who've had that similar experience as you growing up.
And also there are transition seminars that are sponsored by, I'm not sure who all sponsors them, but could you just briefly mention those, especially if there's parents wondering how to help their kids transition?
Yeah, they, most of the transition seminars are for the 18-year-olds that you finish high school and you're going into college or university. There's 3 in the US. There's one that Narramore Foundation does at Biola. Barnabas does one at Cedarville University, and Interaction International also hosts, this year they're doing in Texas and in Georgia. And Interaction is the only one that is offering it for younger TCKs. Oh, cool. So it's open, I think, age 12 or 13 and up to around age 19 or 20. So there's those 3. And so it's usually a week to 10-day programs to help get students ready for this huge transition that's coming up as they're going into university. Okay. So I highly recommend it. I know it's really hard to fit in the summer and schedules and money constraints, but it's not going to hurt students, and it's only going to help them. Yeah. And so it's been super encouraging. And there's actually research out there too about how helpful they've been in that transition.
Yeah. We will link those 3 in our show notes for our audience, so that we can so people can find that. They were great resources. I had the opportunity to go to a transition seminar, and it was pivotal in my ability to cope with that transition.
Oh, and I wanted to do a shout out to the Canada one as well. There's one called Reboot in Canada, which is super great, because I was a Canadian MK growing up in Brazil, but did all my furlough in Alberta. And so they have one in Calgary and also one in Ontario, or one in Alberta, one in Ontario. Okay. For Canadian MKs transitioning back.
Good. All of that's been great information. Thank you, Tammy.
So what are some of the ways that maybe someone who wants to help a missionary kid would maybe hurt instead of help? We've maybe touched on a little bit of that, but can you highlight that a bit for us?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I think one way is just dismissing that experience of like, hey, you're home now, just get over it. That doesn't matter as much. This is where you're at right now. But during those formative, developmental years, it's a really significant part, and it's forming who that person is. So understanding that background. This might be kind of hard to say, but I think in general, that in the US, we're pretty US centric. Mm-hmm. And so it's hurtful, I think, to TCKs who growing up in another part of the world. I've heard a lot of TCKs say to me, I grew up in West Africa. And so I'm like, where in West Africa? Like, I want to know, is it Liberia, or is it Cote d'Ivoire, or is it, Togo or Benin, or where, and they're like, oh, you actually know that there's countries in West Africa. So sometimes I think just in general, Americans, lack of understanding or appreciation that there's a world out there. And so I think, downplaying it, or just that experience.
So not acknowledging it and kind of not recognizing how significant it is in the life of an MK to have lived all the years they did. Even if it's a short window of time, I think sometimes it gets downplayed more if it's like, oh, it was only 2 years. But those 2 years have been huge in the life of that MK.
And I think if someone fails to ask questions, tell me what, very basic questions. What was it like where you lived? How did you celebrate holidays? And those kinds of things that I didn't even know to ask till I lived in another culture and realized how different life was. But now it's so important because holidays and birthdays and other celebrations and so on are so significant in the places where you grew up. And I think if no one asks those questions, it's kind of a lonely existence.
Yeah, I was going to say, not asking good questions, and people say, where are you from? And if I say Brazil, they'll say next, so did you watch the basketball game last night? Like, it's not even like on the same time, like relevant at all. So.
Yeah. And I think it's helpful too to understand some TCKs will choose to not answer questions because they sense in you
lack of interest.
A lack of interest. They're not gonna engage unless you really show an interest. And I mean, to this day, if someone asks me where I'm from, I look at them and the kind of sense of like, how much time are we really going to talk here before I'll answer, and because we have so many facets to that answer, it's not an easy question to answer.
And the same thing goes for third culture kids, just because I was out at lunch today with some people that grew up their whole lives in Washington State in this town I live in, and it goes on me too, to be interested in their stories and where they grew up and where they're from. And because I don't think it is as interesting as mine sometimes, but I need to care for them and ask them good questions too.
Yeah. I remember it was pretty big in my college years. I had a college roommate. I was kind of, a little bit snobbish about the fact that I had grown up overseas, which I think that happens with TCKs at times. We lose our humility there. But she goes, you know what? I didn't choose where I got to grow up, and neither did you. So, it was kind of like, so there, you didn't have a say and I didn't have a say. So we just need to live well with what we were given. And that perspective really helped me from then on, of recognizing she had a story that was her own. It wasn't necessarily something she chose. And I didn't ask my parents to move to Brazil when I was 3. It just, I went along for the ride, So, yeah.
Yeah, my mom says now she would have done it differently. She went to Brazil 7 months pregnant with me. She's like, if I had known differently, I would have. I'm like, no, I'm glad I was born there. But yeah.
One of your 3 passports.
Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about Mukapa. We've talked about transition seminars. What other kinds of resources are available for kids as they transition?
So I think I wrote down, I can talk a little bit more about each of these categories, but I wrote down retreats, coaching, counseling, books, workshops, and I'll backtrack and say the local church and the Word of God. Ultimately, it's the Word of God that's going to change hearts and minds, and also being in a local community. So I think some TCKs aren't as enthusiastic about the American church, but I do think that it can be a place of belonging, of community, of transition support for TCKs. And I've seen that in my own life. And I just found a church. I just moved a couple months ago and found a church. I think that's going to be really helpful to me as I live in my new community. But there are some retreats that are out there for college age. And there is some for adult TCKs as well. And so again, as I hear the college students saying that this has been one of their favorite things, this taking advantage of some of those. There's one in Michigan called Snow Camp, and Compass Ministries does one in February in Georgia. Campus Crusade or Crew just did a March one in Orlando area. So there's different opportunities for third culture kids to get together. And I think in that, it's just really helpful for them to have a breather or a break or being with people who are similar. There's more and more coaching opportunities of helping TCKs think through their stories and what I talked about, that potential of, what do I do with this story and background that God's given me, and how do I use it? So there's different groups doing that. Counseling, I think, on the unresolved grief, on where are we coming from, there's some different, I think it's called TCKcounseling.com, is getting counselors who are have TCK awareness and skills to just kind of process our backstories. One of the books that are counseling book, I would say counseling book, one of the books that's come out is that Lauren Wells book on unstacking the grief tower.
Yeah.
And it's written for adult third culture kids. And so it's a really helpful book of how to process and think through these different grief, she calls them grief blocks, that we've had in our lives, and different ways to process those. Another book that is really good is Tim Sanford's book, I Have to Be Perfect.
Yeah.
And that's a book that we give out to TCKs a lot to help think through these lies that we might have grown up believing, especially as missionary kids, but he's writing from a pastor kid, missionary kid perspective. And so that's been helpful. And then another book that several of us really think is helpful for TCKs is a book called With. It's not specifically about TCKs, but it's about our relationship with God. And that's been helpful. And then, of course,
Sorry, say that title again.
With.
Okay. All
Sky
right.
Jathani. I'm not sure quite how to say his last name, but
Okay.
yeah. It's reimagining the way you relate to God. And so it's been really, really helpful. And then workshops. Lauren Wells at TCK Training has been doing some different workshops. She was we did a virtual Mukapa retreat, and she did a workshop there on the grief tower. So that was really helpful. She did a workshop for Mukapa on relationships, but also on her TCK training site, she has some different workshops that are for college age and adult third culture kids. Those are just, some resources. At Barnabas, where I work now, we're doing some more work with adult third culture kids. So we have a retreat that's for post-university. It's in October in Michigan, usually. Yeah.
Okay. I think a lot of people, we would like to think that, a child raised on the mission field is happy and healthy and well-adjusted and happy with God and everything's okay. But unfortunately, there are situations where a family moves suddenly, or a family member passes away, or there's some kind of trauma, and they come back to the States not happy and healthy and not in a good frame of mind. And so I appreciate what you said about the Word of God, because just like anyone, as they grow and mature, they have to own their relationship with God. Mm-hmm. They have to really decide where they stand, and is it really their faith or their parents' faith, and so on. And so I think when you talk about counseling and so on, it's important that we realize that these kids often need someone to talk to about their experiences, because they haven't all been just really, really great experiences. On the whole, probably yes, mm-hmm. but not always. And so not to assume that when they meet a child that's grown up overseas, not to assume that everything's perfect, but maybe encourage them to find someone to talk to, or try to be a resource for them if you have a sense that they really do need to talk with someone.
Yeah, definitely. And I will say, I think a lot of people, we hear a lot of the scary stories about third culture kids. And this is just a God's grace in my own family. I'm the oldest of four of us kids. And one of my brothers had a really hard story growing up in Brazil with different experiences that happened only to him. But all four of us, are in church and following the Lord. So it's possible. But I do think counseling and debriefing. I'm just debriefing our stories, of having a chance to process and talk through them is super helpful. A place like Sanctuary Inn, where you guys are, is a really great place that missionary families can come, because I know you guys talk with the kids too.
Yeah, I think it's great that you were able to share all these resources, because we have quite a broad audience around the world too, and they can access these. We'll put these all on our show notes for our show today. And I just really want us to get more and more resources out there for people wherever you are, even if your kids don't have a transition seminar to go to in your country. There are these books and resources that we want to get in your hands. So thanks for
sharing. I forgot one. Yeah, one more. Yeah. It's called Third Culture Kids, A Gift to Care For.
Okay.
By Ulrika Ernvik. She's Swedish.
Oh, yes, right.
So it's a really great book about third culture kids, and just, I love the title, A Gift to Care For.
Yeah.
Because TCKs are a gift to care for.
Just a quick question. Does Mukapa have a virtual chapter? Like if someone...
That's a good question. Yeah, so we're actually working on that right now and hoping to start the virtual chapter in the fall.
Okay.
Ideally, community and relationship in person is best.
Sure.
So we would love students to start Mukapa chapters at their school, but we know sometimes either they don't know how to find the other TCKs, or there aren't many on their campus. And so we're wanting a virtual chapter for students who don't have a TCK community or able to start one on their campus.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So that will be on our website, mukapa.org.
Good. Okay. Thank you. And someone might actually be going to school in a place where it's just not possible to have that relationship. But if they had a virtual chapter, that could be an encouragement.
Yeah.
So, anyway, well, Tammy, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it, and we're grateful for the things that you've shared with us.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, Cara, how did you enjoy that interview with Tammy?
It was great to talk with Tammy and hear some of her story. And just, I loved all the resources she shared. There's so many great books and tools and resources out there. And I love that we can get that out there to people.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons we're doing this podcast, is so that we can put resources out there so other people know about them if they didn't know already. And so that's certainly something that's really important to us. You know, something she said today that caught my attention was the word hidden immigrant. Can you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, I think it is a very, very appropriate description for what MK is, and how we aren't already always seen as what we are. Someone who has a whole world of experiences that you can't really tell just by looking at us. Because
when you step back into American culture, you looked very much like all the Americans you were with. And no one at a glance could look at you and say, that young lady just spent her 18 years in Brazil.
Yeah, so I think it's just a helpful term. And that, you know, the cross-cultural stress and struggles that so many people are experiencing, you can't tell necessarily just by looking at them. So I think that's true for anybody. You don't know people's stories. So it's always important to take the time to listen and really pay attention. And I think that was one thing that Tammy brought up, is that just taking the time to listen and be invested and interested in the life of an MK can have a huge impact.
Yeah, ask them questions, talk about them, their life, and things that they knew about growing up, and things that maybe they're struggling with now. So anyway, I'm hoping that people that are listening today are taking note of that, and when they have the opportunity to spend some time with a missionary kid, they can be that person who can ask some questions.
Well, thanks for joining us today.
And we'll catch you again on the Innkeepers podcast. Thank you for joining us for the Innkeepers podcast. Our mission at Sanctuary Inn is to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers. We hope today's podcast was an encouragement to you, or maybe the podcast you heard today, you've been prompted to pass this along to someone you know that could benefit from today's conversation. Creating a podcast is a team effort. Cara and I prepare and do the interviews, and we're grateful for the time that our guests give us out of their busy lives to help us learn more about missionary care.
We want to thank Tim Downing for the music he wrote and performed for the Innkeepers podcast. Tim is a very talented musician, and you can find out more about Tim at downingkeys.com. Our podcast is edited by Javier Bolanos, and our website and show notes are prepared by Micah Githens, my amazing husband. You can visit the Sanctuary Inn website to see more of Micah's great work at sanctuaryinn.org.
Thank you for joining us on our journey to learn more about missionary care.